marvelous way in which this paper basket got back here shows that this is the CFO camp. You just ask for it and it falls out of heaven or somewhere. An old woman was praying for bread. She hadn't a thing in the house. She was starving. She prayed God to send her a loaf of bread, and two little boys on the outside heard her, and they said, "Let's fool her." So they threw a loaf of bread in the window, and old Granny began to say, "Lord, I knowed you'd send it, I knowed you'd send it, I knowed you'd send it." And the two little boys rushed in the house, and they said to her, "Granny, we fooled you. We throwed it in the window." And Granny said, "Boys, you don't understand. The Lord sent it, even if the devil brought it." No. Well, after I went home last night, one of the campers came over and didn't think I'd made a very good job answering that business about killing the people in the Old Testament. He said, "Why didn't you quote from Jesus himself, where he said, 'They used to say in old times, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say unto you, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Pray for those who despitefully treat you.'" So if that little boy is here, I'm quoting Jesus, his answer. There are a lot of things that Jesus changed that were in the Old Testament. We changed the Sabbath day for one thing. We've got it on the first day of the week now. They used to say you mustn't eat any pork, but all of us do, I suppose. You name it, lots of things of that kind. He brought in a new era, and in that new era, we love our enemies instead of killing them, if we follow him. Now today, I'm going to talk to you about the Jesus way to save our world. If you want to read this up later on in books, there are two books that I've written that go into this thing pretty thoroughly. One, somebody came the other day and asked me, "When was it you wrote that book called Wake Up and Bust?" Well, I said, I haven't started that one yet. But I think the one that person meant was Wake Up or Blow Up. And that's a pretty good, still 10 years old, but still a pretty good statement of our alternative, Wake Up or Blow Up. And the other one that you can read is a bigger book, is the hardest one for me to write because it required an awful lot of research in every possible direction. The name of it is The World is Learning Compassion. You'll find, I guess Wake Up or Blow Up is blown up. There are no more, but I think there are 2 or 3 more of compassion over there yet if you happen to want to take it home with you and study how we are changing. For I'm an optimist today. This old United States of ours is having a new kind of a revival. We never had it like this before. In the old-time revivals, they were like Billy Graham's revival now, or Oral Roberts's. The people walked up the sawdust trail and repented and were told to be good after that and to read their Bibles. But this new one doesn't only reach up a hand to God to get right with God, but reaches a hand down to man to get right with human need. It's a double-edged revival now, and is coming in the United States at a terrific rate. I find it all over the United States here, 1961 and 1960. And sure, it's in this camp. I forgot to pray, didn't I? Let's start. Pray with a prayer now. Dear Lord, I thank you for the evidences that our isolationist America, that thought isolationism and Christianity meant the same thing, is rapidly changing to compassionate America. They're beginning to take an interest in the human race, especially in human need. And I pray thee this morning to use my lips and my voice and me and Use all of us, use our minds, and our inner ears, and our wills, and our hearts, to get every last one of us ready to join in this new army, Christian army of compassionate witness that shall go out and capture the world and save the world for Jesus Christ and for peace. Now speak, we are listening. What wilt thou say to us? Come here and stand here and talk here, and let me get out of the way so nothing will be said, not a word out of my mouth that isn't thine. What's thy way of saving this old planet? And how can we join it? Amen. I promised to tell you, first of all, how this old world got this way. I mean, not what I told you last night, but far, far, far back. There was a time when everybody was illiterate. We lived in caves at that time. The men made their wives behave with a big club. If you don't believe it, I can show you a picture of it. And they didn't have any other weapon but clubs. And they killed wild animals that way if they could. They were hunted by animals. They were defeated by brute forces of nature. There weren't very many people in the world. Nobody could read and write. They were just illiterate aborigines. We still have some of them. I've seen some of them down in Australia and down in Basutoland. Bushmen, these Hottentots, and there are some of these primitive pygmies, Negritos, they call them in the Philippine Islands, but not very many, a few million in the world left, like we all used to be, hundreds of thousands, millions of years ago, perhaps. And then about 8 or 10,000 years ago, a little over that perhaps, we don't know exactly the date, some very smart primitive people, aborigines, began to write down with pictures so they wouldn't forget what they had learned, and so they could write to one another, picture writing. The Chinese still use it. Their characters are picture writing. It's just an elaboration of that old method. And then some of the very, very smart ones began to make letters down in Egypt and over Mesopotamia probably. As far as we know, ours came from Egypt. Those hieroglyphics that you can still see if you ever go to Cairo. And believe me, you better go and look at them. They're important in the museum there. They are picture writing. But those pictures gradually changed into letters. Not letters like you and I think of letters, A, B, C, D, but syllables. A syllable was a letter. And I won't go any further in that. Now these people in Egypt and in these other areas where they started writing had discovered one of the most important discoveries in the history of mankind. The people who knew it could make records, could count, could write to each other, could accumulate the wisdom of the others, and they began to forge ahead. And one of the important things was they could write out a deed to the land. They owned it all. You go over to Egypt now. In spite of Nasser, who's trying to break this thing, it's been in Egypt for hundreds of thousands of years, or at least tens of thousands of years. In spite of Nasser, Egypt's still divided into big, big sections, miles in size, and all the rest of the people are illiterate and wretchedly poor. Well, 10% of the people in Egypt and in Mesopotamia and other places were able to read and write, and the 90% were utterly illiterate, utterly penniless. You go over to Egypt now and you admire those great pyramids and those marvelous big temples, and you say, what a wonderful civilization it was. It was horrible. It was horrible. A few people at the top were slave drivers. You better look at the Ten Commandments, and there you see a pretty true picture of the way it was in those days. The lash of the whip over the 90%. Now, it was that way all over the world. 5%, 10% could read and write. They owned the land. They made the laws, and they were the judges. They minted the money and kept it all. They ran the government. They owned the armies. They were the haves. The others didn't know enough to have. They were helpless because they were ignorant. Education, in other words, is a dividing line. In those days, and only 10% were educated, and they didn't want the others educated. They wanted to keep them there because they were cheap labor. In fact, I have a very interesting old man who's a dear friend of mine. Every time I go to Cairo, I live right across the street from him, so I can talk to him day after day. He's an Egyptologist. He knows all about ancient history. He can read all those little scarabs and all those bugs that have inscriptions on them and tell you what they mean. And that old man has told me about this. In those days, the educated people made the others believe that they were divine. They had a divine right to everything. The others had no right at all. They were the ones who'd go to heaven. If you go over there and look at the Great Pyramid now, you'll see an enormous boat that they have discovered there. It's all hidden down under the ground. That was for the Pharaoh to go to heaven when he died. Then something happened that changed the course of history. One day a princess, the daughter of the Pharaoh, was walking along the river. I guess she wanted a baby of her own. Couldn't have any for some reason. And there in the bulrushes she and her maid saw a little baby in a little boat. And went to it, and she fell in love with that baby. She said to her maid, "Bring it along with us." Now, the mother of the baby was hiding, and she saw this princess. So she followed her home, and she said, "I can nurse that baby." So she nursed it. The baby was raised, and he was educated. He belonged to the divine 10% who could know how to read and write. Not only that, but he was well educated. Now that was a great mistake from the viewpoint of the Egyptians, because that little baby was a Jew. Cecil DeMille, who put the great picture of 10 Commandments on the screen for us. Oh, by the way, the woman he brought over to help him, Phyllis Johannes, is now helping us. She's going out to train all the foreigners in the United States. She was brought over from Syria because he wanted somebody who knew and who had that look. And so Cecil DeMille said in my presence, he said, when Moses grew up and led his captive countrymen out of Egypt, it's the first time in human history when a captive nation was able to escape from its captors. And it was the first time in history when any nation believed that everybody ought to read and write. Because when they got over to Israel, Moses, the educated man, had written, he could write because he was educated. He had written laws, and everybody was supposed to read those laws, and therefore everybody's supposed to read. And that's the first time in history that any nation ever believed in universal education. They do now. The Jews all read and write. And that's the reason why Jesus could go into the synagogue and ask for Isaiah, and they gave it to him, and he could read it. Everybody could read and write. It's a very, very tiny little nation. On here you your thumbnail can cover more than, or your fingernail can cover more than the whole of Israel. I've got it over there now. A tiny little place is the only place in the whole world where there wasn't this division between the smart ones that had learned to read and write and kept the others ignorant. In fact, they made the hieroglyphics and the writing difficult. I'm absolutely positive that in some areas of the world they made it so hard so people couldn't read it, excepting those who were on the inside. But now, years and centuries passed, and then came Jesus. And then came this stupendous explosion that we've talked about here called the Pentecostal explosion, in which, when the Holy Spirit fell upon those Jews, they were all Jews, he sent them out across the world carrying the great good news of Jesus Christ. I hope you know what I'm talking about right now. I forgot to tell you what it is, so I'll tell you now. You see these yellow stripes? They stand for gold, for progress, for prosperity. See these black stripes? They stand for hunger and starvation. And the red stripes were black too, until they turned red. They stand for desperation and a very desperate attempt to get rid of hunger. Now, why is it that the world is yellow here with prosperity, black here with hunger? That's what we're at now. Here's where this explosion took place, right under my finger. But when it took place, like any explosion, if it runs against a mountain, it doesn't go through it. But here was the Arabian desert. If you've ever crossed that with an airplane, you've seen that there is a desert as wide as from the Atlantic seaboard all the way to the Rocky Mountains, and as all sand. You look down on there and you can't see a thing but sand. They couldn't cross that. You had to walk. Nobody walks across there. And here, if you look here, on the map you see an even bigger one. This isn't as big as from here to the Rockies. This is bigger by half again than the whole United States, right under my hand here. I can't put my hand on it all. A stupendous desert. The biggest desert in the world is the Sahara Desert. They couldn't go down to Africa. They could go down along the Red Sea here, and they got to Ethiopia. You remember the Ethiopian who was converted by Philip? They could go across the Mediterranean Sea because that was a wide open road. You remember how Paul got to Rome on a boat. They could go up and down through what they called Asia in those days because they had good roads. If you've ever been to Rome, you will want to travel on the Appian Way. The Appian Way, about is longer than this church, this building, about 200 yards, is open now so that your automobile can go over it. It was built more than 2,000 years ago, and it was covered for centuries and centuries, but now they've opened it up so you can take a look at it. That road that ran up from the south up to Rome, Paul walked on it. He walked over the Roman roads. Whenever you look at these crooked ways, you people who are studying Paul's travels, what in the world did he go way up like that for? Because it was an excellent Roman road. The Appian Way was one of them. I've traveled over there several times, and my goodness, friends, I must confess it, although it's over 2,000 years of age and made of stones, it's smoother than 2nd Avenue, New York, where I live. We've got cobblestones over there, and your taxi goes bumpity-bump, but it doesn't bumpity-bump on the Appian Way. Now, when the atomic explosion of the Holy Spirit took place, it followed open roads, and it was blocked by deserts. And that's the reason why it didn't go east to India. One man did get down to South India, Kerala, Thomas, it is said, and they still have the church there, but that's about all. But it was easy to cross through the Mediterranean. It was easy to go up along the Atlantic coast. It was easy to get up to England with sailboats. And that's why our ancestors became Christians here. And then when it became easy to get across the Atlantic with bigger and better sailboats, or at least sailboats, with the Mayflower and the others, our ancestors began to come across here bringing Christianity with them. And bringing with them the idea that everybody is a son of God potentially and has a right to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, and to read and write. That's why. Now, wherever 100% or 90% of the people read and write, their progress shoots ahead. There we exchange our knowledge. There this person learns something, that person learns something, that person finds out something, and they all write it up. And it gets in our scientific journals, and our improvement goes on and on and on like it is now. We can produce so much that we have a superabundance. Electric lights. This thing making my voice louder, I hope. And all of these other improvements, when they work, that we have in the United States, the frigid air and everything else, those automobiles you came in, the airplanes that some of us come in, the railroads, everything else is possible because Moses taught the children of Israel to read and write, and we still believe in it. And where they don't believe in it, where 10% have a divine right, then the 90% they don't know it, but they're a burden or a millstone on their necks, and they hold back progress. That's why these people are hungry. Don't blame them. The most ignorant thing I ever hear in the United States is somebody say, why don't they do it like we do? They would if they could, they can't, that's the trouble. And they're going to try, that's the trouble too. Because up here they were that way. Russia, China. 13% in Russia were literate when the communists took over. Now this, as I told you last night, was awful bad up to 1900, but now it's become awfuler badder. Now it is terrible because the population has exploded. If we don't have stayed home and mind our business, it would have been all right. But we went out there to do them good, and we did. We made them live twice as long, made more, 2.5 times as many people as there were 60 years ago. And now they can't feed them because they don't know how. They're ignorant. And that's our trouble. The colossal wrong in the world, it's awful, is that the United Nations says, and Paul Hoffman says, 2/3, and the United States government says, no, don't exaggerate, it's only half of the people who go to bed hungry every night. Only half of the little infants moan through the night for milk their mamas can't give them because their mothers have no milk in their breasts. They haven't any food to beget the milk. Only half. And there they are under those black stripes. And the United States government sure doesn't exaggerate. It doesn't want to maximize, but minimize the truth. It's somewhere between those. Here's where they are. And this is the interesting thing. They're non-Christians. Because the Christians believe. Now, it's true down here in Latin America, you're asking about that. An awful lot of them are non-Christians, and a lot of them are Catholics. But those benighted Jesuit, I don't mean Jesuit, but Spanish priests who went down there want to make a little empire for themselves. It didn't depend on the Bible. Moses wanted people to read the Bible, the Old Testament. The Protestants want people to read the Bible, the whole thing. The Catholics depended on the priests. And so our American priests who go down there now are terrible in their criticism of the old Spanish priests who want to make a little empire for themselves, and they were just exactly like the ancient Egyptians. That's why these stripes are black. Now, I've gone far enough for that. And I want to talk to you about 2 ways of making this awful wrong right. The awful wrong being this, that half to 2/3 of the world is getting hungry all the time, angry all the time, more desperate, more revolutionary, red-eyed, grim-faced. I live among them. The reason I hesitated is because I could break out bawling And the reason I feel that way is because I feel them behind me. I'm sort of mystical, I guess, but I kind of feel that half to two-thirds of the world want to talk through my lips to this lovely CFO camp this morning and tell you how we feel. We're hungry. We don't want our children to be that way. The missionaries have come over here and told us that isn't God's will either. We thought it was. Hinduism says that this is karma, that we're hungry because in our previous incarnation we sinned and now we've got to suffer till the sin's all burned out. We thought we had to take it. But your missionaries came here and said, no. The Spirit of the Lord, said Jesus, is upon me. He's anointed me to preach good tidings to the poor, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to open the eyes of the blind, to heal the brokenhearted, to proclaim the kind of a world the Lord does want. He said, I came that you might have life more abundantly. And then we've seen you going by in your automobiles. We've seen the clothes you wear, the food you eat, the house you live in, the money you spend. And we no longer believe our own religion. We don't believe karma. We're going to come up. And at this very moment, along comes a man who has an idea. His name is Karl Marx. Of course, he's dead long ago. But he wrote a book in which he said, this awful wrong, the rich having everything and the poor having nothing but starvation, less than nothing but debt, that can be remedied this way. Let the government have it all. Take it away from the rich. Let everybody be leveled off. Everybody become a government employee. Like the soldiers are, like the postmaster is, like all the government employees are. Everybody have a government job, and then we'll all rise together. We'll have a classless society. No rich, no poor. Karl Marx's philosophy landed in Russia just at the point right after they had that awful revolution in which they turned on the Tsar and the aristocracy, and they killed 20 million of them. Communists didn't kill them. These outraged, hungry people did. And then the communists said, this is what we mean. If the rich don't submit when you take away everything they have, you have to put them under the ground, out of the way. Russia went communist because Russia was hungry, angry at the 10%. The 90% revolted just like the French Revolution. Oh, while I think about it, I will forget it later on. The reason why England didn't have a French Revolution was because John Wesley came there. He not only made people feel good and saved their souls, but he cleaned up England so they didn't have the awful things that were going on in France, just like Russia. You all know that, I suppose. The reason why China went communist because she was hungry. Japan had gone in there, you know, and she had bled her white, took everything she could away from her. And the warlords of China were bleeding the poor people. A little group at the top owned everything because they were the educated people, and the rest were hungry. And down came these communists from Russia, and they said, we found out what to do. Take it away from the warlords. They're your enemies. And if they revolt, put them under the ground. Now they've got 1/3 of the human race, 1 billion people, are trying to follow that idea. It isn't working. It's working all right in Russia. I mean, phenomenally. Russia is far ahead economically of what it was under the Tsar. But it's a big failure in China so far. In fact, the greatest, hungriest area in the world today is that 1/4 of the human race, the Chinese. Terrible, because it didn't work. Take it away from everybody, then the Chinese, who were always independent and had their own little land, took it all away from them. They sabotaged it. They refused to work. Now they're starving. Down here on these black stripes, under these black stripes here, the conditions are just like they were in China and Russia. And they're, any moment, the next one, like Cuba, is liable to blow up and go communist. And so the communists are there. This is what they say. We believe everybody ought to be educated. In fact, when Lenin, the first communist leader of Russia, took over, he made it, listen, a criminal offense to be illiterate. You can't be illiterate in Russia. They won't let you. They'll send you to Siberia. That's where they imprison them. Put them out there to work in that awful cold place. And then, in order to make it easy, Lenin revised their alphabet. He said they'll never learn to read with an alphabet like this. It wasn't as bad as English, but it was too bad for him. And in a dictatorship where you can tell everybody to do this or die, it was easy to change it over. Another place where they changed over was on our side of the Iron Curtain. That was Ataturk in Turkey. He changed over from the Arabic alphabet to a very good Roman alphabet in one summer. Well, Lenin did. Now they've got such an alphabet, so good, it's as good as Spanish, almost perfect. So good that any adult in Russia who spoke the language could learn to read it in 1 month. There isn't anybody in this room who can read a word that he never saw before. You're not sure how to pronounce the vowels. I can't. You can't. Nobody in Oxford can. Nobody in Cambridge can. Nobody even in Harvard can. Because our spelling's so crazy. And so today, Russia is practically illiterate. Nobody is illiterate in Russia excepting Morons, insane, and blind. And they even make the blind learn to read by the Braille system. Now the Russians go around the world and say, we believe in the divine right, although they don't believe in God, in the inalienable right of everybody to an education, to progress, to prosperity. And if you go communist, we'll help you get it. But of course we have to take it away from the rich and give it all to the government. That's one way. That's what they're trying. That's what I don't like. Because I don't believe in murder, and I don't believe in robbery, and I don't believe in hate, and I don't believe in a class war. But it's going to win if we continue the way we've been going. Because although we believe our Christianity, we haven't practiced it, as Marcia told us here this morning. Around the world, we said, Lord, Lord, but we thought the world was a pretty good place to exploit. Oh, we sent a few missionaries out there. The reason I'm here, not out there, my wife wants to go. She's crazy to go back to one of those countries, and so am I. But I can't go because there aren't enough of us. We're losing your war for you. And I'm back here to try to find recruits, to find an America that will wake up and do something to save the world. Because if you don't wake up, you won't be destroyed by communism from inside. You'll be overwhelmed by communism from all over the world. They'll hate you. All you have to do is neglect those poor people. All you have to do is drive past them with your automobiles and get out with your camera and take a shot at them and then get in again and go away, and you've made them hate you. I would too, if I were starving to death. So we got to help them. Now the other way is the Jesus way. And that's the way of compassion. That's the way he lived. That's the way he told us to live. That's the way we ought to do. And the moment we begin to do it, oh, it's so easy. I wish I could make the clock stand still, like Joshua made the sun stand still this morning. But I see it's going. And I'm going to have to telescope a lot that I had to say. So much to tell you about this. I'd just like to tell you stories of how easy it is to win those little people, the very ones that hate us now, are taught by the communists that they're the only ones who care, that we are along with the educated 10% over there want to keep them illiterate because you can have cheap labor. They're told that. They believe it. And the only way to prove it's a lie is to make it a lie, to go out and do something about it. It isn't a lie as long as we don't do anything. They're exploiting them and we're indifferent. So we're going to change. I'm not scolding. I'm just telling you about the United States in 1959. But she's changing. My country is. Didn't I tell you about how the government's changing? I don't mean the Democrats, Republicans. Mr. Eisenhower started a movement he called the People to People while he was still president. And I'm glad to tell you, with over there in Kansas City, that's on the way now, and he's ahead of it. Across this nation there is getting to be a new realization. You've got to lift that world or they'll hit you and destroy you. That isn't the reason we lift it. But the reason is that's the Christian way to do, and we forgot what Christianity was. God himself hates the way we are. I've hurt you enough. Now I've come to give you good news. I want to tell you about this book here. One of the problems, a very acute one, every businessman here knows it very well. With our disarming, if suddenly we and Russia stopped threatening to destroy each other, we're always on the edge of a war by accident, and yet if we stopped, we'd have a terrible financial crash unless we did something. Now, what something shall we do? This man, Seymour Melman, is a professor of industrial engineering in Columbia University. The President of the United States has read this book, and there are others who agree with him. In fact, I don't find anybody who doesn't. It's called the peace race. And he says the way to stop communism from capturing the world with promises is for us to go out there and change these black stripes to yellow stripes, gold stripes, by introducing industry all over the world. He said, we ought to spend an awful lot of money on this, $20 billion. Now, he said that isn't much for America. In fact, it would just improve our prosperity, because we would be making the tool machines. Many of you businessmen know what a tool machine is. Every automobile is made by a tool. That hood, that engine. First there was a tool machine that made that machine. See what I mean? And we would make those. We would convert this great industry that is now manufacturing bombs and missiles and guns. We'd turn them right over into manufacturing tool machinery for the world. And we'd go out there. It would take us all the rest of this century to help the rest of the world, because there are 8 times as many of them hungry as our population, 16 times as many people outside of the United States as there are in our country. That's our job. And we can invest $20 million in that. Now, he said, you don't have to stop, have a disarmament to do that. All you have to do is start that, and you'll have disarmament this strange way. The Russians now are tightening up their belts. They don't get as much as they want. They're not starving, but they don't get any luxuries, and their government says we've got to keep up with America. We've got to keep up or she'll destroy us. So they're spending every last cent they've got. They couldn't afford to spend $20 billion to help industrialize the world. We would do it, and they couldn't. We could win the friendship of the world, and they couldn't unless they did one other thing. They'd have to stop the military race, or else they'd have to give up this economic race. And says Melman, they'd give up the military race, because what's the use of spending all that money if you lose anyhow? And they would suddenly say to us, in the hope that it would make us collapse, they would say to America, we throw up the sponge. We can't militarize anymore. We're going to demilitarize entirely. Come in and examine us. Then we'd have this terrible financial crash, unless we turned the $50 billion that we're now spending for missiles and bombs and guns and military, we turn that into a tremendous effort to lift the whole world up to catch up with us. Now, instead of $20 billion, we would be spending $50 billion all over the world. We would have no depression, because all our industries would be booming at full speed. All our people would be employed in peace instead of war. And I believe that's what the President of the United States would do. I wrote him about this book, if you will let him. Now, there's a lot of people who are afraid to do that, because they put although we say in God we trust, they don't. In bombs we trust, in missiles we trust, in hate we trust. In fact, they are trying to terrorize you so that they'll make more money. Actually, one of the best names for the thing we're in America right now is terror for profit. Our newspapers scare us. Why, we've got 2 to 5 times as much military as Russia has now. We wouldn't need to spend any more for a long time. Only we've got to do it to make money, to keep up our industry. We've got to scare ourselves unless we adopt this plan. So I think there's the Christian way. It's absolutely 100% Christian. Go out and help the rest of the world to catch up with us. Now that's 1/3 of it. There are 2/3 to this thing. You go out and hand these industries and machines and all that sort of thing to illiterate people, and they'll just ruin them. They can't use them. One of the mistakes we made, unintentional, it was we didn't know any better. During the early days after the First World War, UNRWA sent out thousands and thousands of tractors and plows and caterpillars and all that sort of thing. And all of them are lying out there unused now, ruined because they were illiterate. One of your men here in this group telling me how in his own industry there were 2 illiterate people. He can't give them skilled work to do. He can only give them unskilled work. And he has to be very careful about that. Now, that's the trouble over there. So, Seymour Malman's plan will work only if we go out and educate those people, lift them up out of their illiteracy. And that's our job. I'm very glad to say that the Army, I told you last night, is keen about that now, getting the soldiers at work, teaching them English. Because, oh, by the way, everybody in the world wants English. I went out there to teach them their own language, but I found out, I'm almost ashamed to tell you about this, that they would rather learn English than their own language. I'd be too. For example, down there in Africa, here is Kenya Colony. Down there, 2 boys came to me, educated boys. They could speak English. And they actually wept while they told me this. It wouldn't make you weep, but it made them weep. The British are trying to force us to learn Swahili here. Swahili. What literature's in that? Swahili. Does that put us into the mainstream of human affairs? Swahili. What have they got? Just a few little books. We want English. The British don't want us to have English because they don't want us to catch up with the world. Well, now I found all over the world they think we're trying to keep English from them. Well, let's prove we aren't. Let's give it to them if they want it, and give it to them good. Now, a lot of you can go out and teach English right away, you older people, you younger people. And one of the great things I'm trying to do now is to make English easy enough so that they don't go crazy trying to learn it. Because it needs just what Lenin did to the Russian alphabet. It needs to be made perfect, or needs to be made regular. And it's so easy to do. Now, I am not going to talk more about the government. I've already talked enough. I'm delighted to tell you that the women's clubs of the United States, under Mrs. Arnold and her predecessor, are out to try to do all they can to educate the world. I'm glad to tell you that Rotary is in Kiwanis. I'm a Kiwanian. I'm glad to tell you that CARE is getting into this now. In addition to sending food and other things in boxes, CARE is going to try to help educate the world. Glad to tell you about schools. But none of that's enough. I've given you 2 things, but they won't do. One is to industrialize the world, and the other is to educate them so they can use that machinery intelligently, to write the books for them so that they will know how to do it. But that isn't enough. If you give education to a bad man and he still remains bad, he's a badder man after he's educated because he can do more harm. An illiterate bad man can do a little harm in his little local area, but an educated bad man is a menace as far as he reaches. Hitler showed us that, and many others. What they need now, and without this, none of this other will work. They need to have Jesus Christ in their hearts. They need to be born again. They need to have their wills, their purposes in life lifted out of selfishness, out of meanness, out of sordidness, out of callousness, up to the great, glorious love of Jesus Christ. What does that mean? It can mean only one thing. It means that the church has got to get in on this act. It hasn't so far. I didn't tell you, or did I, that I heard John Coventry Smith stand up while I was sitting at a banquet. He held up a $1 bill like this in front of that banquet. And this is what he said. He said, you give that to the collection in the Presbyterian Church next Sunday, and this much of it will go abroad. Can you see it? I can barely see it. 3 cents out of that dollar. 97 cents will stay right here in America. 80 cents will stay in your own church. 17 cents will go for what they call home missions. 3 cents abroad. That's to carry the gospel. But it isn't enough to preach the gospel. Preaching the gospel stirs up hope, makes people dissatisfied unless you fulfill it. And in order to fulfill the gospel, by teaching the people to read and write, by teaching them how to farm, by teaching them how to help themselves, only 1/10 of 1 cent out of a dollar, 1 cent out of $10 goes abroad. And yet the church must go out and save the world. So we've got to do more than we're doing. And that's the reason why we have this, what we call this new movement that's going across America called the Army of Compassion. I've got a pamphlet here. I was telling the ministers about it yesterday. My colleague didn't send enough of these. I wish I had one for many of you. Tells you how to organize one of those companies of compassion in your own church. I'm very happy about this. Everywhere I go, every church I go to, if you've been in one of them, you know it's true. A group of people, when I get through, say, I'm going to do this thing. And then they start, and they talk to others, and others, and others, and others. They have 100 of them, or maybe 200 of them. Each of them, in order to save the world, say, I can afford to do this if it's that important. I'll give $1 a week. That'll be $52 when the year's up. 100 of us, $5,200. And we'll have some project out there. Maybe we'll send an American man and his wife who are educated, who know how to teach English or some foreign language, or who know how to write the books they need, or something else. Or maybe we'll use foreigners, native Christians out there. And I'm happy to tell you that that thing is going across this nation, great guns. I'm thrilled about that. I know now that the American people are ripe as a plum. I know now that you, sitting in front of me, every last one of you, is worried. I know that you're all frustrated. You wonder what's going to happen to the world, but you don't know where you can take hold. I know that some of you are frightened. I heard Stanley Jones say that if you aren't scared now, it's a sign you are not educated. And it is. The educated people are scared, or else they've said their prayers and are ready to blow up. And then they're scared about the rest. And so you want to do something. I've told you what to do. Go home, talk to your church people, individuals. Who has to start this? The preacher? No. In fact, you don't have to start it in your church. You don't want to, but you can. You can tell your best friend, I'm going to get $1 a week into this thing. I'm going to get into the act. I'm not going to be on the bleachers watching the world blow up. I'm going to get into the game. And the way to do it is $1 a week. And you and I will tell 2 more and see how soon we'll have 4. And then we 4 will tell some more and see how soon we'll have. In other words, you become a missionary to your own church. To get that church to have this over and above what they now give for their church. Not a cent away from the church. That 97 cents is all good. I should have said that a minute ago. Every cent of that is good, but you can afford, unless you're a very unusual and unfortunate American, you can afford to give another $1 a week, and you'll never miss it. And with the money we'll never miss, we can save the world. Now that's going across this country. What's your part? Very obvious to me. Start a company. Tell your minister. Tell them we're starting it here. Now, the next thing to do is to know how to get that person out there. What channel will you use? Try your own mission board first. Tell your minister, let's try our mission board. See if they'll cooperate. I can guarantee the Methodists will. I can guarantee the Southern Baptists will. I'm pretty sure the Presbyterians will. I am hopeful that some of the rest will. They're coming over fast. Not very fast, but I wish that's faster. But all the mission boards pretty soon will be having these extras. They'll call them companies of compassion. And then you'll feel good. You'll feel that you're doing your part. And then you can pray, God help everybody in the United States to do his part as I'm doing mine. And if everybody does that, it'll be easy. There are 500,000 churches in America. There are nearly 100 million Christians in America. And if we, each of us, would give $1 a week, we'd have an immense amount of money that would be easily enough to save the world. One thing you can do. We need a lot of speakers. Don Gilmore over here in Cincinnati, vital young man, minister there in the church in Groesbeck, he heard me. He said, I'm going to do my part from now on. And he is. All the southern part of Ohio is hearing about this thing and across the river. We need 1,000 ministers, 1,000 people in radio and television and newspaper writers, a great army of people to explain it to America. That's all America needs, just to have it explained. The American people are ripe as a plum. They're eager. They don't know what to do, poor things. I've been trying to get Chautauqua, I hope next year. That great center up there where 20,000 people meet, to invite 1,000 of the leaders of America to come there next summer and learn how to explain it to America. Give her what she wants. And then we need a lot of people abroad. If any of you go abroad as tourists, don't go until you've talked to me about it, or written to me, or Renlo, or one of my associates. And we'll give you a list of people to meet out there. And first take a little course. One of these, we have what we call workshops that last a week. We have courses, 100 of them, all around America. We have them very close to here. Louisville, Kentucky, we have one. Over at Asbury College we have, I won't go around, up here in Indianapolis. Margaret Fisher has one. All around America here we have these courses. You can learn about literacy and then go out and talk to the Department of Education. We'll give you their names. Go out and talk to the missionaries and find openings, because you can't go until we find the opening, the invitation. We need a lot of that. I could name if the clock. Oh, it's stopped already. You hear that? I'll tell you more if I ever get another chance. Defeated. We know the way. The government's on the way. The clubs are on the way. The church is getting on the way. And all those black stripes will turn into prosperity and education. It's going to be easy when America gets moving. It'll be just as easy to educate them as it was to make them healthier. I suppose we'll have another unexpected problem on our hands when we do. But that's all right. It's God's way. It's what Jesus is asking us to do. And when you get into this thing, oh, you'll feel so good. You can pray now. I can't pray for bombs and missiles. Can you? I can't pray to blow up Russia. Can you? But I can pray to bless the world. I can pray that the communists may see Jesus in us and decide to go the Jesus way instead of the murder way. Can't you? Yeah. That's what we can do. So let's all get in on the act. And the Lord God will bless us. It's so appropriate for this CFO camp. In fact, I think many times that Glenn Clark had the hand of God put on his shoulder to start this for such an hour as this. Thank you. Well, let's pray. I think that's what you want to do, don't you? We thank you, Lord, that we don't have to wring our hands. Wouldn't do any good anyhow. We don't have to witch hunt. It would only do harm anyhow. We don't have to scold the Pentagon nor the government nor ourselves nor our churches. All we have to do is the constructive thing, love, and go out and begin to do what Jesus did with his 12, each one win one in our church to this new glorious way. All we have to do is help our America to turn her back on this fear that now makes her build up these awful lethal weapons of annihilation, and turn her back on that and turn her face toward the great glorious vision of fulfilling the Lord's Prayer that thy kingdom may come and thy will may be done on earth and in the hearts of mankind as it is done in heaven. That everybody on this earth may have their daily bread, no black stripes of hunger. That everybody in this world may forgive everybody else. That everybody in this world may be free from temptation and from evil. We thank you that we can not only pray it, but help it happen. In Jesus' dear name, amen.